Hello and welcome to this presentation about OCR Gateway Module B2, Understanding Our Environment. In this session we're going to talk about classification, and in particular binomial classification, the binomial system. Here we've got our traditional hook bubble, just to get you thinking at the very beginning. You should be able to use your prior knowledge to classify this organism, its name is Paramecium, into the kingdom that it belongs to. If we start by looking at its observable features here, you can see this area here, which is its nucleus. Now the fact that it's got a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles means that it can't be a member of the prokaryotes. Equally, because it's unicellular, it can't be a member of the multicellular kingdoms, so it can't be a member of animals, plants or fungi. So this little organism belongs to the kingdom Protoctista, or the junk drawer kingdom. Let's take a quick look at the things you should be able to do by the end of this video. You should recognise that organisms of the same species are very different to each other, but nonetheless they still have more features in common with each other than they do with members of a different species. You should be able to use the binomial system, so that's Latin names, to name organisms and understand where each part of that Latin name comes from. And you should be able to describe 3 problems in an exam to do with classifying some species. So by way of a starter, we've got 4 hybrids for you here. Now your task is to try and work out their parentage. Let's start off with the names. So here we've got a tigon, and you can probably work out that's the offspring of a tiger and a lion. Next we have a mule. That's a male donkey and a female horse. Here we've got a zonkey, zebra and donkey. And finally, and my favourite, there's the labradoodle. Now there's a question relating to these. All of them are sterile apart from one. Now, hopefully you can identify that the one that isn't sterile, so it can have offspring of its own, is the labradoodle. And the reason for that is that the labradoodle's parents both come from the same species, they're both dogs. That's part of the definition of a species that's really important you learn, and we'll discuss that in a minute. So here we've got some examples of members of the same species. They've got lots of features in common. They all have hair, they all have claws, sharp teeth, canine teeth, binocular vision, so they've got eyes on the front of their head. I could go on. However, they also show variation, so there's a lot of difference in, for example, coat length, coat colour, leg length, and so on. They're very different to each other. This is the definition of the species that I was talking about earlier on. It's normally 2 marks in an exam. You need to point out that members of the same species have similar appearances, and for the second mark you need to be able to say that they can breed with each other, that's interbreed, to produce fertile offspring. That's offspring, or babies if you like, that can go on to have babies themselves. So we've discussed the features that members of this species, dogs, share with each other. We've discussed how they're different. Now let's look at the features they share with a different species. This one. So this is a jellyfish, and you're probably struggling a little to think of features that they've got in common. No legs, for example, or eyes. We'll probably have to go right back to Mrs. Gren, the 7 Signs of Life. So it's alive, so are dogs. So they share features like their ability to move, they can respire, they're sensitive to their environment, they need nutrition, they excrete, etc., etc. But there are very few features that they share, these 2 different species, and that was our first learning outcome that we needed to cover. Just to ram the message home here. Okay, so on the face of it, this is a pretty easy question. Of course, it's a cat. However, depending on what part of the world you're currently studying, it may also be
el gato,
in Spanish,
le chat,
in French,
Mao,
in Chinese. So if you're a scientist studying cats and you were going to an international conference with other cat experts, you might find a bit of confusion in terms of having all these different names for the same organism. Similarly, if you were trying to look up papers that other scientists had written on your organism of interest and they were all referring to it under a different name, that could become quite awkward and you could waste an awful lot of time that way. So a bright spark called Carl Linnaeus came up with the idea of naming organisms in Latin. So making sure every organism in the world, once it was discovered, was given a unique two-word Latin name, hence binomial, two names. And here are some for the cat family. This eliminates confusion. So scientists all over the world who are studying tigers will study it under this Latin name. If you have a look at the format of binomial names, you'll notice a number of things, and these are very important. You can lose lots of marks all the way up to A level for getting this formatting wrong. The first letter of the first word is always a capital. The first letter of the second part of the name is always lowercase, and if you are writing on a computer, you must put it in italics, and regardless of how you're writing it, you must underline it. That's to make the name jump out from the page so you can scan papers quickly and simply to find the organism that you're interested in. The names give us lots of other information as well. For example, you can find out which ones of these cats are most closely related by looking at the first part of the name. This represents the genus of the organism. So in this case, we have two members of the same genus here. Panthera, Panthera. So these two cats are more closely related to each other than they are to these three here. And here's the man himself. This is Carl Linnaeus. He was Swedish. Here is his binomial system. This is the genus. This is the species part of the name with the lowercase first letter. Okay, in this part of the PowerPoint, we're just going to discuss a different phylum to the vertebrates we've been looking at, and that is the arthropods. There are several groups of arthropods you need to know about. They all have these things in common. They all have jointed legs. That's what the word arthropod actually means. They have an exoskeleton, so that's an external skeleton, made of a substance called chitin. They have a segmented body, and they have no backbone, because they're not chordates. They're a different phylum, they're arthropods. Now if we look at some of these subgroups here, these are the insects. They have 6 legs. They have 3 body segments. Crabs are an example of crustacea. These are the myriapods, meaning many legs. That's a millipede, by the way. And these are arachnids, spiders and scorpions. If we're thinking about putting things into groups, we should think about whether this is done according to natural rules, if you like, so according to evolution, or whether that's down to humans making a decision just to put things into groups based on a couple of obvious external features. That would be artificial classification. In this diagram, we're classifying organisms based on the similarity of their DNA. So if we use this family tree, if you like, you can see that African and Asian elephants are quite closely related, and they have a recent common ancestor. If we go back a bit further, we can find a more distant common ancestor that they also share with a more distantly related group. That's the manatees and the dugongs. So again, this is a measure of the genetic similarity, and from that we're trying to get an idea of evolutionary relationships. That's natural classification. So now moving on to our last learning outcome, you should be able to state why some organisms are difficult to classify. Our first example is bacteria. Now, if you remember, the definition of a species was a group of organisms that have similar physical appearances and can interbreed to produce fertile offspring. Now, the problem with bacteria is that they don't reproduce sexually. They reproduce asexually by something called binary fission, which means splitting in two. So, how do we really know whether they can interbreed to produce fertile offspring? And the problem is, we don't. It makes them hard to classify. Another example would be these organisms. So these are organisms with observable features that don't match the rest of their group. So both of these, that's a dolphin, and this is a whale. They both belong to the group mammals, so like us, like horses, cows, etc., etc. However, they don't look like the rest of their group, the rest of the mammal group, because of the habitat that they share with, for example, fish, sharks, etc. And so therefore they've evolved streamlined features to deal with that aquatic environment. So they've evolved flippers, very pointy nose, etc., etc. And we finish where we started, with the hybrids. These organisms are difficult to classify because they're sterile. So if we think back to our definition of a species again, that's a group of organisms with similar characteristics that can interbreed to produce fertile offspring. These can't. So they're not given a binomial species name because we can't classify them. And you should be able to have a quick look through those learning outcomes, maybe pause it, and just check that you can do each of those three things. By way of a plenary, have a go at this exercise. Here we have Britney Spears. You should be able to remember the 7 levels of classification. If you want a hint, the mnemonic is kings play chess on fine glass surfaces. Try and write down the groups that Brittany belongs to at each level, starting with the kingdom level. And here is the answer.